Well, welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us today on Play Conversations. It's a real honour to have you with us.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And when I last met you, I met with you in Massachusetts. We were just saying many years ago now. One of the things that we discussed, and I wanted to bring this up because it's quite topical here in New Zealand at the moment, is we discussed the difference between the US school system and the New Zealand school system. And I shared with you the curriculum that we have here, and that the curriculum itself is child-centric, and it really is quite rooted in developmentally appropriate learning. And we know that our early years curriculum is something that is well respected internationally because it's centered in a play-centric approach to learning. As I speak with you now, we are facing a potential change in government, and the electioneering that is going on at the moment really indicates that the parties that may be coming into power are very much focused on the rhetoric around standardization, the teaching of the basics of literacy and numeracy, and more time spent in class learning, and none of this, wasteful time. So I wanted to really start with your thoughts around the impact of the likes of standardization, policy, and the like, having come from America, on the decline in play and obviously the subsequent consequences of that as well.
Wow, I'm sorry to hear that those changes are being proposed. I guess one way I can address that question is by kind of looking at the history of how education has changed in the United States, certainly over my lifetime, but even just over, I guess, since maybe about 1980, there's been kind of a continuous change. When I was a child, way back in the 1950s, school was not the big deal it is today. There was no homework in elementary school, at least not the schools I went to. There might have been some more high achievement schools that did, but the schools I went to, sometimes a teacher might ask us to write a poem or a story or something fun like that at home. At that time, I guess a lot of the experience that students had in school, especially in elementary school, depended upon who your teacher was, because teachers really could pretty much do what they wanted, right? And most teachers, of course, most people don't go into teaching, especially at the elementary level, unless they kind of like kids, and so they like kids, and they were sort of attuned to the kids, and they would kind of modify what they were doing. There wasn't any formal, this is child-centered something or other. There wasn't anything formal about it. It was just that teachers are human beings, and they would see these kids and they'd see, well, Johnny needs a little bit more of this, and Sally doesn't need that. She needs something else, and they'd kind of modify it in accordance with what they perceived. I remember very well fifth and sixth grade. I don't remember so well the earlier grades, but at that time, sixth grade was also part of elementary school. And I happened to have the same teacher for both of those grades. It was a combined fifth and sixth grade. And in that school, we had 6-hour school days, but 2 of those hours were outdoors playing. We had a half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, a half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon, a full hour at lunch. And during those times outdoors, we could do pretty much whatever we wanted. There weren't teachers out there telling us what to do. They may have been watching us. I don't know. If they did, they weren't. I think they were just resting in the faculty room, probably having coffee and telling stories about us or something. But we would have snowball fights. This is in northern Minnesota. We'd make snow forts, and when there wasn't snow on the ground, and at that time, boys all carried pocket knives. We'd play games with knives, things that are totally outlawed in school today. I mean, you'd be thrown out of school if you carried a knife into school today, So and I remember, even despite the fact we were never indoors more than an hour at a time at that time, in that school at least, and I think that was kind of typical. But even then, she would say sometimes, "Well, I see you're kind of restless. Why don't you get up and play?" And this was not kindergarten. This is fifth and sixth grade. She had things like hula hoops in the classroom and jacks, and we'd get up and play for a few minutes just to take a break. Now, I that's not at all like what schools are today. The change has been somewhat gradual, but the change really was speeded up beginning in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And it was speeded up when the government took more control of schools and it became more centralized, and there was standardized testing, and whole school systems began to be judged by whether the scores on the children's standardized tests were improving or not. Teachers are being evaluated on that, not on whether the kids like them or not, or, not on the things that really matter. They're just on those stupid standardized tests, which have very little, if anything, to do with the real world. And so school became gradually changed. So the more creative, fun, recreational things were gradually taken out of it. More time in school. The school year became longer over the years. Recess was largely taken away from many schools, and greatly reduced essentially in all schools, taken completely away in some schools. And so what has happened to children over this time? I don't see any evidence that people are learning more as a result of this, of anything that matters, right?
Yeah.
You study for these tests, and then you get to take the test, and then it's gone, and then you prepare for the next test. I mean, this is just going through hoops.
Mm.
I think that there was a kind of a more sense of involvement with the real world in the past, and even some of the class time was devoted to things that have real world significance, like meal preparation, or how to how to uh, how well, we actually had shop classes and
Mm.
home economic classes. Those have been taken away
Mm.
because that's not being tested on these standardized tests. So
Mm.
those changes. Now, over the same period that these changes have been made, what do we see as a result of that? Now, I can't say totally that this is cause effect, but I'm sure that it's partly cause effect. Children have become, over these decades that we have changed from this kind of more relaxed idea about school to this very tightly controlled curriculum-based school with more and more homework, more and more testing. Even, believe it or not, in kindergarten, they're being tested and they're being given homework. What we're seeing is huge, gradual over this time, but ultimately huge increases in anxiety, depression, and suicide among young people. The suicide rate among in teenagers, the same is true for younger children, but of course younger in terms of the proportionate increase, but younger children don't commit suicide very often. It's hard for them to do it, even if they wanted to do it. But teenagers, the rate of suicide among teenagers is now about 7 times what it was in the 1950s, and this has been a gradual increase. Rates of clinically significant anxiety and depression by standardized questionnaires have similarly increased by about that fold. Huge increases. There was a survey done a few years ago by the American Psychological Association called Stress in America, and normally in this survey they only include adults, but that particular year, which was 2013, they included high school kids as a category. Turns out the high school kids were the most stressed out group in America, more so than adults. And 83% of them when asked so they were asked what are the sources of your stress, and they could check off various things. 83% checked school, by far and away the most checked item. The next most checked, which was something like 62% or something like that, was worry about getting into college and worry about my future. So we've got a generation of young people for whom the whole academic venture is the source of their distress. For what purpose? So the other thing that's happened is we have had over this period of time huge increases in what are called learning disorders. So dyslexia is an example of such a learning disorder. It may be the most common one, which is supposedly, I mean, it's the people who write about dyslexia believe it's a brain disorder in the nervous system. There's something wrong with your brain that makes it either impossible or very difficult for you to learn how to read. And there's a lot of writing about it, brain scans, and so on and so forth. But but isn't it interesting that this disorder has been increasing? And there is now research, which I've summarized in an article, showing that if you start teaching children to read while they're still in preschool, they're teaching them reading skills, that greatly increases the rate of diagnosis of dyslexia in the kids who are in that program.
Gosh.
Greatly increases. So this is not brain, this is the fact that you're making these little kids do something that they don't want to do, they don't have any reason to do it. They are being made frightened of this thing. What's called dyslexia, there's more and more evidence, at least the evidence that I've pulled together, and I actually did a survey of parents who have supposedly dyslexic kids who then took their children out of school for homeschooling. And what essentially everyone told me was the problem wasn't that my child couldn't learn to read. The problem was my child was frightened to death about reading. He had been made to feel ashamed. He'd been made to feel frightened, been made to feel I can't learn to read, I'm inadequate, and so on and so forth. What essentially every one of these parents said, and there were about 13 or 14 parents in this group, said was, what I had to do was simply hold back. We're not even going to talk about reading. If you want me to read to you, I'll read to you, but I'm not going to ask you to read. You don't have to read because that's clearly stressful. Every one of these kids at some point decided they were now ready to read, but the whole thing was overcoming the anxiety about it. So this is what we're doing when we try to force these academic lessons on younger children. It's bad enough in my mind to force them on anybody because everybody, my experience studying children who are in self-directed education, either unschooling at home or in a democratic school where they're not being required to do any curriculum, they follow their own interests, they all learn to read. There's nobody who ends up being called dyslexic. Really, truly nobody. At least nobody so far out of hundreds.
Yeah.
So but some of them learn to read far later than others. And I don't think it has to do with the brain. Maybe the brain plays a little bit of a role. Maybe there are brain differences. I think it has to do with when you get interested. So some kids learn to read when they're 3, which tells me my son could read by the time he was 3. I know other kids who could read by, and there's nothing special about them otherwise. They just learned how to read. Of course, my kid is special, but these other kids are not special. But they're, but I think it's something, for some reason, they got motivated. They got driven to learn how to read. And once you really are motivated to learn how to read, it's not that difficult to learn, no matter what age you are. There are people who are older adults who grew up in communities that where nobody can read, and they decide to learn how to read, and they learned how to read, so, and there are little kids who can learn how to read. We make it difficult in school, and then we make a big deal out of it when some people don't learn it on the schedule that the school wants it. So all of this focus it's based on very short-sighted reasoning. So first of all, the first step is to believe that somehow we can measure education. Somehow there's an objective way of measuring it.
Mm.
And that's an absurd idea. It's absolutely absurd because everybody's education is different. How could we ever say, let's say that somebody wanted to measure whether you are more educated or I am more educated. What would be the measure? You know, we have different interests, we have
Yeah,
different needs, we have different predilections.
yeah,
Why even talk about comparing us on that? There
yeah.
might be some interesting things. Well, these two people are different in this way. Isn't that interesting? But to
Mm,
say that one of us is ahead of the other, how absurd. And wouldn't either both of us feel really stressed out if somebody was trying to compare us that way? And kids are compared like that every single day in school. They're behind or they're ahead, on something that in the real world of life doesn't even matter. It's just absurd what's happening with education worldwide.
mm. And it's something that I know um, firsthand as a mum, and the listeners will know that I've homeschooled two out of our three children, and we've had discussions recently about the diverse thinking that goes on in our family and the way that we all think quite differently. And interestingly, with the awareness that's growing more now around the diversity of, this neurodiverse label that many people get, and understanding the different way people think, we've entertained the idea of maybe finding out whether maybe one of our children or even my husband might be thinking in a different way or might be considered neurodiverse if we were going for a label. And actually, we all came to the agreement that it didn't matter, because it would only matter if our children were in school, because now they would have to fit into a box. That means that they have to have a label to explain why they're different, instead
Right.
of that box being different for them. And that was something that I think was a big eye opener for me.
I think, there's actually, from an evolutionary perspective, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so I tend to think from an evolutionary perspective. From an evolutionary perspective, there's a good reason why we are different from one another. In that, through most of history, and to a considerable degree today, um, people did not work alone or make decisions alone. They worked with other people. And if you're working together on something, it's very valuable that you aren't just all the same. That some of you are thinking one way, some of you are thinking another way. I've written about this in relationship to so-called ADHD, this. So, imagine a hunter-gatherer band and you're out on a hunting trip and there's a group of, typically it would be men, out on this hunting trip, and you're following the tracks of the animal that you're trying to track. And there are some people who are very focused and deliberate about this track. But then there are other people, the ones that might get diagnosed with ADHD today, a little less focused, a little more distractible.
Mm,
They're the ones who notice that there's a tiger sneaking up on you from behind, or, oh, there's a better animal over here. Why are we focused on this track? There's actually a research study that I described in one of my blog posts where this was done in schools. What the researchers wanted to do was to look at the possible disruptive effect of including a child who had been diagnosed with ADHD in a problem-solving group. So they formed little groups of children. Some of the groups, none of them had the ADHD symptoms, and other groups, they would put one child who has an ADHD symptom in the group. And they gave them these problems to solve. And they recorded the whole conversation towards solving the problems. What they found was, as predicted, the ADHD kid tended to disrupt the smoothness of the conversation. But lo and behold, the groups that had an ADHD kid in it solved the problems far more quickly, far more reliably
Mm,
than the ones that didn't.
mm,
And and the way I would interpret that, I mean, I think the researcher was just surprised by that. That was kind of not a not expected thing.
mm,
They expected disruption, but they expected the disruption would prevent them from solving the problem. It helped solve the problem.
mm,
And I think the way I think of it is this. So these were problems that really require a little bit of creative thinking. If you've got people who are very focused, they're just really focused on what is the most obvious way of solving this problem, what seems like the most obvious way of solving this problem, but that wasn't working. But they didn't give up on it. The
mm,
kid with ADHD was kind of flitting this way and that way. He says, "Well, you know, he's more thinking out of the box. He's not so focused, and he comes up with something. Some of them are crazy, some of them are ridiculous." But it sort of stimulates a broader way of thinking, and maybe he then comes up with something and somebody says, well, you know, maybe that would work, and then the focused ones focus on that. Oh yeah, that does work. So
yeah.
so there's a real advantage in any work group that of having people who think differently and combining them.
Mm,
um, Kind of
mm,
along this line, I have a friend who's actually a rather famous biologist, and he's, among other things, he's chair of a major biology department, actually at Harvard Medical School, and he was hired, he was kind of recruited by biology departments all over because he's famous for knowing how to put together teams who can work together. And so at one point I asked him, so what do you look for in a team? And what is it that really makes a good scientist? You seem to be the expert on what makes a good scientist. And he said, first of all, there's no single answer to what makes a good scientist. That science is done in teams. Science is done, no, there's no such thing as the lone investigator anymore. It's all people working
mm,
together.
yeah.
And what you want is a diverse group of people who have different ways of thinking and different kinds of skills. So some of them are kind of like stamp collectors. They just like to collect stuff and put things together. Some of them like to tinker. They're the ones who kind of get the equipment going.
Mm,
Some people are a little crazy. They come up with crazy ideas, but every once in a while they come up with one that works. And so I think he articulated very, very well exactly the point that I'm making in our modern world. We want people who are different, and yet we've got a school system that's trying to make everybody the same. It's taking all these kids who are all different from one another, different personalities, different interests, and trying to homogenize them into something all the same. And
mm,
there are some kids who can adapt to that, and there are other kids who can't adapt to that. And the ones who can't adapt to it get a label, and maybe they're put on drugs. If their parents are smart, they're taken out of school. So
mm, yeah.
that's what's
Yeah.
happening in our world.
And this probably leads us nicely into another area I wanted to talk about, because I know you've shared in your for your Substack community 3 letters about the power of mixed age play, and you've asserted a number of points, with really the summary around that being that mixed age play is more fully playful than age segregated play. Can you elaborate on that further, and what that means for us when we think about children in school?
Sure, sure. I like to talk about that. It's interesting. So really, age segregated play, where you've got all the kids are the same age, within a year or so of the same age, which is typical. I mean, we segregate children that way in school, and increasingly even out of school, we segregate children that way. That's, from an evolutionary point of view, that's abnormal. Historically, children were never segregated by age. In hunter-gatherer bands, there wouldn't even be enough kids to play with other kids who are all your same age. So a typical play group, and the kids are playing most of the time, the typical play group might run from a 4 years old up to 13 or 14 or 7 years old to 17, So kids over a wide range of age are playing together. My research on mixed age play was done many years ago. My most empirical research, direct study research, was at the Sudbury Valley School, a school for self-directed education for children. There are children there from age 4 through high school age, through 17, 18, 19 years old, who are never segregated from one another by age and who are free to follow their own interests. And so you see age mixed play all the time. Even at a time when the school was big enough that there were enough kids near the same age, so they could have self-segregated, they didn't.
Mm.
The little kids are attracted to the big kids, and believe it or not, the big kids are attracted to the little kids. They like to play together, and they play together. And it's so the things about mixed age play are the following. First of all, it is more in terms of what children are learning. There's more to be learned in mixed age play. So the little kids are being brought up by the older kids to a higher level of play when they're playing together. So, I mean, think of it. The example I like to give is if you had only 4-year-olds, think of the things that would just not be possible for them. They wouldn't even be able to have a game of catch because none of them could throw the ball straight enough for the other one to catch it.
You're
They
diabolical.
certainly couldn't play any games that involved reading or that involved keeping score because they don't know how to do that, right? So they're
Mm.
very limited in how they could play. Now, put a couple of 8-year-olds in that group, right?
Mm.
And the 8-year-olds, an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old can have a good game of catch. The
Mm.
8-year-old can toss the ball right into the hands of the 4-year-old, and that's a kind of a challenging and fun thing for the 8-year-old to do, as well as, of course, for the 4-year-old. And the 8-year-old can run and leap and catch the wild throw of the 4-year-old, so they can actually have an enjoyable game of catch. Or maybe they're playing a computer game together and there's words on the screen, but the 4-year-old couldn't play that game because the 4-year-old can't read the words on the screen, but the 8-year-old can.
Mm.
And in the process, the 8-year-old might be pointing out to the 4-year-old, see that word? That says press here or whatever it says. So in some sense, the 8-year-old, not because the 8-year-old is trying to teach the younger child to read, but in some sense, that's what's happening just to keep the game going. So
Mm.
the older children are constantly scaffolding the younger ones into higher levels of play when they play together. That's one of the advantages for the younger children. Another advantage for the younger children is that they are in some sense being cared for. So they can do more dangerous things if there's an older child there because the older child will protect them from it. One of the reasons that they're at Sudbury Valley, adults don't have to follow the kids around because they're older kids, who will catch them if they fall or, or go over if they get hurt or something like that. So that's happening. They're kind of extra caregivers. And the advantage to the older child, the advantages to the older child are maybe even greater than to the younger child. The older child is learning how to explain things to somebody who doesn't understand them, and in explaining things, you kind of develop a better understanding of them yourself. The older child is learning how to be a leader and how to be a caregiver, and developing a kind of sense of his or her own maturity and the understanding I can really help another person.
Mm.
In addition, even just as the younger children are being inspired and brought up by the more sophisticated and higher level activities of the older children are often being inspired by the greater energy and creativity of the younger children. So, an example I sometimes give is, at least in our culture, teenagers oftentimes don't they sort of lose their interest in kind of artistic and creative things like playing with clay or coloring or painting with watercolors or building with blocks and so on and so forth. But in a setting where there are younger children doing this kind of thing, that in some sense gives them excuse to do
Mm.
it.
Yeah.
And they're doing it with younger children or they're doing it themselves, and they develop their own creative abilities to a far greater extent than they would otherwise.
Mm.
The other thing that happens is when older children and younger children are playing together, it can't be fundamentally competitive. It becomes much more nurturing and playful in the sense of nobody cares about beating the other person, even if you're playing a pseudo-competitive game. At the time that we were doing this study, it happens that chess was a fad at the school. And there were a lot of cases where there'd be teenagers who were pretty good chess players playing with much younger kids who were complete novices. And they'd be seeming to have fun together, but they were having fun because they worked out creative ways to do it, where the older child would sacrifice a lot of men right at a lot of the parts right at the beginning, would try very risky moves, more creative way of playing, and also, of course, would explain to the younger child, if the younger child made a bad move, would explain why that was. So it was more of a teaching example, but it was also an opportunity for the older child to play with different kinds of openings in the chess game, different ways of playing the game. So, or let's say you're playing an outdoor game, you're getting up the game of baseball outdoors, or softball or soccer, or whatever it is you decide to play. If you've got older kids and younger kids, you have to figure out some creative way to keep everybody happy in this game. You have to modify the rules, you have to change it so you have to pitch softly to the little kids, or you have to give them some extra break. This involves a lot of thought and creativity. You're developing a kind of an understanding of the need to accommodate to human differences when you're playing. There's all this kind of learning that goes on and creativity that goes on when it's age mixed play that goes on. I don't say it doesn't go on at all when it's all the same age, but it doesn't go on to the same degree.
Mm. And it just, as you were describing the permission, I think that older children get from playing with younger children, particularly in that sort of the arts and dramatic play. I know we often talk here in New Zealand. We have often the time in schools when our older children are sent down to the junior end to help the teacher. And usually the junior teachers end up noticing that it's the older ones that are dressed up in the tutus and the hats and and they're helping the younger ones dress up, but it's actually the older ones that are right in character, which is an observation to see.
Yeah, I think that's likely true.
So, and on that note, the other topic I wanted to cover with you was around that socio-dramatic play and the pretend play that we know is so important for children. And in your book, Free to Learn, you comment that it's actually one of the most complex forms of play. Why is it so complex, and why is it so important for children to engage in pretense?
I'm sorry, I missed that word. You said it's something kind of play. I'm not understanding it.
Complex form of play.
A complex form of play, yes. Well, think of what little children are doing. So let me put it this way. It's hypothetical deductive reasoning is by logicians regarded as kind of the highest form of human reasoning. This is an ability that that scientists have, that theoretical physicists have, and so on and so forth. It's also an ability, I would argue, that all of us have that plays an important role in our everyday lives. It's the ability to imagine something that you haven't experienced and that may or may not be true. And then if you assume this is true, then what are the consequences of that? So this is tested with syllogisms. There's sort of formal tests of this. The developmental psychologist Jean Piaget used to give these kinds of syllogism tests to children of various ages. And he would do it in the standard way where, somebody who comes across to the child like a teacher is asking him these questions. So The question might be, so so he might say, so uh, I want you to imagine this, that all cats bark, right?
Mm,
All cats bark. Muffins is a cat.
mm,
Does Muffins bark? And what Piaget found when he asked this question was that children beyond about 11 or 12 years old would give him the answer that he wanted. Yeah, Muffins barks.
mm,
Children younger than that would say, oh no, Muffins would go meow, right? So he concluded, based on that kind of a test, that younger children are not capable of thinking in this kind of abstract. They're not capable of accepting a false premise and going with that false premise as if it were true, and then what would be the consequences of it.
mm,
Uh, so he believed children could only think concretely. They could only think about things that were true, that in their experience were true. So think about a little children, 3 and 4 year olds, who are playing in a make-believe game. So an example that I sometimes give is, imagine a couple of children or 3 or 4 children who are playing in the kitchen, and they are pretending that the kitchen table is a bridge. And one of the children says, there's a troll under the bridge. Well, right off, this is hypothetical, right? I mean, there's a troll under the bridge. Nobody challenges it. They say, oh yeah, there's a troll under the bridge. And then another child says, well, we better give it a cookie so it doesn't eat us.
mm,
That's hypothetical deductive reasoning. We're
yeah,
pretending there's a troll under the bridge, and if there is, this would be one of the consequences. Or another
corrective
child
penalty.
might say, well, we better not go under the bridge because maybe it'll eat us up. So they're thinking hypothetically all the time.
Mm,
There's even research where people have repeated that study that Piaget did, but
mm,
they've done it in a play-like context. So so instead of asking the question as you might, as if it were a serious question, they would ask it as if, well, we're just playing. So,
mm,
and they would do it in a play-like way. And so the researcher would sort of say, would be looking into a box and say, I'm looking into this box and wow, it's a whole different world.
mm,
And in this world, I see cats. Oh, and all the cats bark in this world. Oh, and there's Muffins. Does Muffins bark? And even 3 year olds will say, yeah, Muffins barks. So as
mm,
long as it's pretend,
yeah.
they get it. It's
Mm,
just when Piaget asked it as if it were a serious question, they took it as, this person is just trying to trick me into believing that cats bark. I know cats don't bark, and so I'm going to
yeah.
give them a serious answer. I mean, this seems to be a serious person asking me a serious question. But as
Mm,
long as it's clear that it's pretend, so the main difference between the 11-year-olds and the 3 year olds, or other kids in Piaget's experiment, was not a difference in thinking ability. It
mm,
was a difference in the fact that the older children knew what this game was all about.
mm,
They
mm,
knew what Piaget wanted them to do. The younger children didn't know this game of syllogisms, and they didn't really see it as a game. They thought, here's a serious person in a teacher-like way, seeming to test me as to whether I know whether cats bark or say meow. I'm just elaborating that one example, but of course there are other examples of it too. So,
yeah.
so children are practicing in play this highest level of activity of being able to imagine things that either don't exist or that you've never experienced that maybe could exist, and thinking about those things in a logical way.
Mm, mm. And this has implications again when we come back to putting everyone in a box, measuring them against a standard, setting a benchmark, that we're actually limiting their opportunities to engage in that high level thinking, aren't we? And the power that pretense has for our children.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Mm,
We're really dumbing kids down when we when we put them in that kind of a box, and we treat them the way we treat them. The same kids that look kind of stupid in the classroom look brilliant when they're playing. So it's we're the great development psychologist, Russian development psychologist Lev Vygotsky used to say that children are a head taller when they're playing than when they're not. They're ahead of themselves. That play is how children really acquire abilities, and then later on they can put those abilities to work in more serious endeavors. And that's well illustrated in this syllogism example. They're acquiring the ability in play to think in imaginative ways, and then later on they can apply that ability in solving real world problems.
Yeah, and this is the often misunderstood connection, isn't it, between play and learning, and the seriousness of play for our children.
Right,
Setting that
right.
connection. Yeah. Well, look, the last very quick question I have for you to finish is one that I ask everyone that comes on the podcast, and I suspect I might know, although I might be surprised with your answer, is if you could wave a magic wand, what would you want to see? How would the world look for children and for their lives with this magic wand?
Well, of course, there are so many things one would want to do if one had a magic wand. I'd do away with the global warming. You know, I I'd make politicians reasonable. There's a whole lot of things that I would do with that magic wand if you were to give
Yeah.
it to me. But I think that your question probably has to do with what would I do in terms of more direct changes in children's lives and what we're doing to children. I think the big point that I've been talking about all the time is that our our understanding of how children become educated is completely wrong. Our long-term understanding, the understanding we've had now for several hundred years, the understanding is that we adults educate children, and that we do it by reward and punishment. That we decide what it is they're supposed to learn, and we ensure we try to ensure that they learn it through a system of reward and punishment. We reward them for learning with A's, with praise, with you're better than everybody else, all that kind of stuff. We punish them. In the old days, we punished them by beating them. Beating in school was very common, not all that long ago. And in fact, there are some states in the United States where spanking is still allowed in school. Not generally for failing your lessons. In the past, it was for failing your lessons. but so we punish them not physically, we punish them psychologically these days. We punish them by telling them they're behind, by telling them they got a low grade, by telling them that they've got some kind of disorder, you know. And so, and that's our system of education. And that's been our system of education for years and years. When that system of education first started, it made sense to people because people had a different view then of what education is. At that time, what education really meant was teaching children to be obedient. The belief at that time, when the first schools that really are the precursors of the schools that we have today were developed, they were developed during the Protestant Reformation by people who believed, yeah, it is important that children learn how to read so they can read the Bible. That was the reason it was important. But even more important, it's important that the free will, which is the playground of the devil, get beaten out of them. And literally beating, was the primary educational tool. You go back and read the instructions to teach to classroom they were called masters in those days, and it is about, don't spare the rod. Your primary job is to reshape the child's will. And that was the purpose, and so schools were developed for that purpose. and they've never changed since. The basic procedure of school, where you are, oh, the other purpose, of course, was indoctrination, and then biblical indoctrination. So the way you indoctrinate is you have them repeat something over and over and over again until they've memorized it, until it seems familiar to them, and so they begin to feel like this is truth, and they're not allowed to question it.
Mm.
And schools still largely operate that way, not with biblical doctrine, but other stuff that's presented as if it's doctrine.
Mm.
This is the right answer. This is the one you're going to get on the test. This is one you have to repeat, right?
Yeah.
And we no longer beat children, but we punish them in ways that I think are every bit as cruel psychologically. So, and this is crazy because children come into the world burning to know, wanting to educate themselves. They are so curious. You can't stop them from learning unless you lock them away in a closet. You don't have to force them to learn. They will learn. The reason we have to baby-proof our house is they want to explore everything in the house. What'll happen if I drop this lamp on the floor? They're not being naughty. They're exploring. So they are constantly into things, and that curiosity doesn't stop as they get older. It broadens and becomes more sophisticated. But we kill it when we put them in school because now their questions don't count anymore. It's only the questions of the curriculum. And even the teacher isn't that interested in the questions in the curriculum. This is just going through hoops, and the kids know that. And so it's an empty experience. It's a waste of their time, and it's killing their curiosity. So to me, if I could wave my magic wand, everybody would agree. What we need is to stop trying to educate children. What we need is to develop the kinds of settings where we provide all the things that children need to educate themselves well. What those things are is a lot of other kids of age mixed, lots of interesting things to do, a variety of adults who have different interests, who love the kids, but are not judging the kids, but who can answer questions, can be helpful when somebody asks them for help. I know that this works because I've studied graduates of people who've gone through this kind of education, and they're doing very well in the world. And they're happy growing up. They're not anxious growing up. Some of them who are brought into that school came precisely because they were anxious and having dramatic problems in the regular school. Others came just from the beginning. Others came just because they wanted to come. But regardless of why they came, they do fine in that kind of setting. It's so much easier. It's so much less stressful for everybody. It's, once you see it, you have to kind of see it. People think this is nuts because it doesn't fit with what everybody does, what everybody believes. But once you see it and see it work, it's very hard to be even slightly sympathetic with what our culture is doing to children.
Yeah. And I'm nodding profusely because I have experienced it firsthand with my children as unschoolers, world schoolers, and as a teacher, as a trained teacher, it took years for me to de-school and let go. That there was that on top of it. But boy, I have been blown away by my now teenage children and the resiliency, the determination, the self-identity, and the desire to keep learning. I'm not having to battle with my 16-year-old to do homework and to be engaged in learning. She is self-directing and is curious and asking questions about the world. So I agree. It's hard to convince people of that unless they've experienced it. But boy, once you've experienced it, it's magic, absolute magic.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I could wave a magic wand and everybody thinks as you do, we'd be better off.
Well, we're working on it. We're definitely working on it. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today with this podcast. I know there will be lots of people that will really enjoy listening to you as always. I always enjoy anything that you have to say, and certainly your book Free to Learn really was the catalyst for me in my journey to step away from education and in the role as a classroom teacher, but also as a mum of children who I wanted to preserve their childhood for as long as possible. So it had a profound impact on me. And I just want to share with everyone listening too that Peter's continuing to share his knowledge through his Substack website, Play Makes Us Human. So please go on there and subscribe. There's some fantastic information coming through there as well that we certainly share on our Facebook page whenever we see it come through. And I know many teachers and parents are enjoying the letters that you're writing through that platform now as well. So thank you for that. So thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.